Hello, hello, and welcome back to the Yalt Podcast, and happy Valentine's Day. Personally, I don't really celebrate Valentine's Day, although you can't really tell because I purposely did choose to wear this red sweater intentionally to be festive. And I also intentionally definitely chose this funky nail design. If you can see the video, then you can see my nails at the moment. I chose to be super festive. So do I celebrate or do I not? I don't know. I do have some Valentine's Day plans tonight, though, with some friends. So that's kind of the extent of my plans for Valentine's Day. But wishing you one. If you do celebrate, would love to know what your plans are. Would love to know if you celebrated or not in the comments down below. So let me know. So as we get into today's topic, if you know me, then you definitely know that I hate small talk. It is not something that I have ever been good at, and I just don't like it. Which is funny because if you watched the first episode, then you know that I have a background in corporate sales. And so naturally you would think small talk would be something that I am really good at. Turns out that is not the case. I think it is too high level for me. It feels a little too brief and vague and fake, if I'm honest. And so I would rather just get into the real of what is going on in your life, what is actually happening in the world, and talk about more meaningful conversation. Like, let's just skip the formality and let's go right into it, because that's what I really care about, is deep conversations, really getting to know a person and what's underneath kind of the top layer of how's the weather, So with that same spirit, today we are going to do the same thing on the podcast. We are jumping right on in with the second episode to some heavy topics of mental health, perfectionism, and how both of those things are part of my story and how both of those things have led me straight back to Jesus. Only by his grace, though, if I'm honest. And so I would love to talk about that today. And before we get into it, I would love to just say that I am obviously not a mental health professional. I am not a doctor. All I can share is my own experience and how that has impacted my life and what I've learned through it and the resources that I've specifically used on my journey and what's been helpful for me. And my hope is that if you are walking through anything similar, if you heard any part of my story and you think it resonates for yourself, that there might be some resources or at least some solace in knowing that you are not alone and that some of these things do have a name. And maybe it's anxiety, maybe it's depression, or maybe it's burnout, or maybe it's all three for you. But some hope in that there are resources and that there is some hope on the other side of those things. And so all I can do is share my story today and hope that it helps somebody. And if you can't relate to any of these things and you haven't faced any of these things for yourself, I guarantee that you know somebody who either has, or might be walking through some of these things at least partially in their lives, and maybe you can take some things away for them as well, or at least to understand them a little bit better. And so that's kind of my hope with today's episode, is just to really be honest with my story and how I'm looking at it from my vantage point at this moment. I am definitely not here to say that I am healed, that I am on the other side of any of these things, but I have made a lot of progress and I am very aware of where I am at kind of in that journey. And so, like I said, all I can do is share with you my experience and what's been helpful for me. And hopefully that's helpful for somebody else as well. So with that being said, this is going to be a story about how one girl's perfectionism, constant striving, has led her to anxiety, burnout, and depression, but eventually it led her back to Jesus. And so let's just get right into it. So you know how in interviews, they always ask you the question, what's your biggest weakness? And when I used to answer this question, my answer was always perfectionism, because I was so painfully aware that I was a perfectionist, and I obviously was aware that it was a weakness and a challenge, at least in some respect. But what I did not know is how big of a weakness and how big of a challenge that actually might turn out to be in my life. And so there was some part of me that thought in those interview questions that this was just an innate quality that I had. This was just something that I was born with. It was something that I couldn't do anything about. And so it was just something that I was just going to have to learn to live with and spin it as something that was really positive. And so in those interviews, I used to say, I know this is a weakness, and sometimes it makes me take longer on a task because I'm wanting it to be perfect, etc. And I am very aware that it could be a weakness, but at the same time, look at how much of a strength it is to be a perfectionist. It does enable me to be really good at my job, or really good at school, or really good at completing projects, really good at managing my tasks, etc. And so I really believed that. I really believed that although this thing that I thought I was just born with that I couldn't change was a weakness, that there were so many positives to it. And I do think that's partially true. But it wasn't until the last few years where I have really come to understand how much of a weakness and a challenge this perfectionism has brought to my life and has been in my life. And so I think this contributes a lot to my mental health journey, and it's hard to say whether or not if I wasn't ever a perfectionist, then maybe I wouldn't have mental health struggles. I'm sure I probably would in one way or another, but I'm just here to share that I think is a big part of my story and why we're going to start with that. So my journey of perfectionism started, as most stories do, with my childhood. And I was constantly striving for straight A's. I was part of the most amount of clubs, and I tried my best to maintain an image of perfectionism to absolutely anybody around me. This, of course, looked super harmless from the outside. I was just a shy girl who knew everybody, but nobody really knew me. And I was getting good grades, and I was super involved all over school, so what could be the issue? Well, thankfully, growing up, most things felt like they came super naturally to me. I would only pursue things that I was good at, maybe also. And so, either way, maintaining that level of perfectionism felt relatively easy because most of it was in my control. Getting good grades came naturally to me without much studying. Being part of clubs was fun, and it made me feel accepted by my peers. And so, it was something that I could do easily. And even something like singing or softball, all of these things came to me pretty easily with some practice or with some time. So, again, what could be the issue? Well, what most people didn't see, and what has taken me a long time to understand, is maybe some of these weaknesses and negative traits, was that what most people didn't see was that when I got a B on my report card, it would send me into an anxious spiral, because I was so afraid that I was not good enough or that I would be in trouble for that B. And so I would be so worried about it. And internally, as an Enneagram Type 1, I'm a really big critic, and I am the biggest critic to myself. And so I just remember beating myself up when I was younger of like, why'd you get that B? Why didn't you study more? If only you just like worked a little harder, you could have got an A and everything would be fine and perfect. And yeah, most people didn't see that. Most people just saw that I got good grades and that I was happy and walking around school. But also what they didn't see was the constant exhaustion that I felt from filtering what I said and worrying about how I dressed so I could fit in and seem perfect. But at home, again, what most people didn't see is that I would cry myself to sleep because I hated myself so much that I just wanted to be anyone else, because all I saw were all of the flaws that I had, and I thought those made me not good enough. And so all I wanted to do was be perfect, and because I couldn't be perfect, I wasn't enough. And I just remember, thankfully, my mom being the person that was there, speaking so much life over me and telling me that God made me fearfully and wonderfully, and that I was enough, and the B didn't matter. But I didn't really know what to do with those feelings when I was younger, because they felt so big and they felt so real, and the lies felt like truth. And so I believed them. And although I wanted to believe what my mom was saying, although I wanted to believe what the Bible and God said about me, it was hard to believe those things. And even something like spilling milk on my shirt would cause me to get upset and immediately have to go change into a clean shirt, because that shirt was no longer perfect because it had stains on it now. And so I think most people didn't see those things, and I didn't really know what to do with those emotions or those feelings at the time. And again, I just thought they were something that I was born with, that I was going to have to live my life trying to figure out how to live with these things and live with this critic in my head that thought everything I did that was slightly imperfect was colossal. And look back on those things, and it's easy to wonder if that's just part of childhood and part of growing up is learning things about yourself and feeling bad about yourself for different things, or going through puberty and not feeling awesome about yourself, and going through a phase where you had glasses and braces, because that was me. I did go through a phase of having glasses and braces at the same time. And I look back on those school pictures with a lot of ick towards myself. But it's hard to say if those things were just part of childhood or if there was really more going on there. And it's easy to maybe see it from this side of it. But again, from the outside, it was all working in my favor because I did well in school. I got into a good college, so I never thought twice about it. And in college, the same theme, unfortunately, continued. But this time, it didn't all come as naturally to me. My first year of college, I struggled to make friends because I was so used to hiding away from deep and meaningful relationships just in an effort to maintain my perfection. So perfection and building community did not come naturally, and so it left me really distraught, partially because I didn't have any friends, but also partially because I was like, what is wrong with me? Why can't I make friends and have a community? And I think the perfectionism that I couldn't do it was hard. And my once 3.9 GPA in high school quickly changed my first semester of college because I got a C in calculus. And I spent countless hours with tutors and countless hours in office hours. And for the first time in my life, it didn't come so naturally anymore. And my hours of time and my hours of striving did not result in perfection anymore. It really just resulted in good enough to pass, so I didn't have to retake the class anymore. And that to me was so challenging. I was proud of myself and happy that I passed and happy I didn't have to retake the test, but there was something so significant to me about trying so hard and still failing to meet perfection that just didn't sit right with me. And I remember tearing myself up about it for that entire semester and beyond. And so then I started doing research into classes on which classes were easier, so that way it would be easier for me to get an A, and not specifically which classes I was maybe most interested in, because it didn't matter. I was more so concerned with how could I maintain perfection and get a good GPA, which I'm not saying that is necessarily wrong. I think there is some strategy behind like choosing things that you are maybe good at, especially if they are classes like that don't necessarily pertain to your major. I had to take several science classes to get a couple of science credits, and I took biology. I was really bad at biology, and I knew that, and it was a struggle for me to do well, similarly to calculus. But after that, I started researching which other classes fell within my science credit that would maybe be a little bit easier. So it worked out. But I'm not saying that was wrong. I'm more so just highlighting, I think, my priority being on perfectionism over anything else. And with more extracurricular activities available to me in college than there were in high school, and with time being mostly my own, and there being an option to do something at almost every hour of the day in college, there was not much to stop me from filling every waking second with something. So honestly, I did just about that. I was so overinvolved to the point that I would not have time to eat, actually. And I remember this was later in my college career, but I remember calling my mom to basically, quote unquote, walk with me on the phone to the dining hall because I had not eaten all day and I was so dizzy and nauseous that I thought that there was a real possibility that I was going to pass out on the way to the dining hall because I hadn't eaten all day. And not because I was trying to starve myself. Based on what I just told you, you might think that would be the case, considering I hated myself when I was younger, but it was not an eating disorder. It was not because I hated myself. It truly was. My priority was 1,000% on doing the most, getting my homework done, making sure everything was perfect, being in the most amount of clubs, and that took so much priority over simply my basic needs, which was food. Like, I couldn't even stop to feed myself. And I didn't understand that was a problem. I had a boss at the time who heard that, who heard me say that, and she was so concerned about me. And I just remember thinking, like, why is she so concerned? Like, I don't have an eating disorder. Like, I'm not purposely starving myself. I know I could do a little bit better, and maybe I could keep some granola bars in my dorm room so I don't feel like this anymore, but it's not that bad. Yeah, it's easy to look back on and want to like shake myself awake. Like, what do you mean? What do you mean it's not that bad? There was also a time, to continue to out myself, there was also a time in college where I would call my mom crying, and shout out to my mom. She's already had 3 cameos in this episode for being the one that gets called or the one that has to pick up the pieces of my perfectionism. So shout out to her. But I remember having to call my mom because I didn't have enough time to finish my homework in a day, and I was going to have to stay up late and basically not sleep enough because I didn't have time to finish my homework. And at the same time, I was applying to a second job. I already had a job, and I was an RA. For those of you who were RAs, you know. But I was already an RA. And to be honest, I didn't necessarily need the money of being an RA. It was great to have some help on the housing side and the food, etc. And we did get a stipend. So all that was a really big blessing, and I don't regret it, and I would do it again. But I didn't need a second job. I didn't need the money, and I know that's a very privileged thing to say, but I just did not need that. But even if I did need that, the logical thing to do would be to take something else off of your plate if it was at max capacity to add something else in, and I was not going to do that. I couldn't even handle what was already on my plate, classes or otherwise, and I was calling my mom crying. Meanwhile, I was still applying to a second job with hopes of doing all of it. I was going to do all of it. I was going to do more, and I was going to add more to my plate, and I simply couldn't even handle what was already on my plate. And so all of those are just examples of how this theme of perfectionism has continued in my life, and when things maybe weren't as easy in college, or options were more and more vast, and I had more time to spend in activities, of how this honestly grew into a larger problem for me, and I didn't know what to do with that at the time. I couldn't really assess it as a problem because from the outside everything was good. Everything looked great. And yeah, it's easy to look back on and think otherwise, and it's easy, as I'm sure you could probably tell, it's easy for me to get emotional about it looking back on, because all I see is just like a broken girl. A broken girl who was just trying to be enough, was just trying to be successful. And the way that I went about it was maybe not the best way. And I just want to tell her, like, you already are enough. Like, God already loves you so much. And you already have an identity in Christ that is free from striving. Like, He died. Christ died. So you didn't have to strive to be enough. And that was already a gift that you have. And you already were saved by grace through faith, and you don't need to hold on to this anymore. You don't need to go all day without eating. So anyway, it's easy to look back on and just want to tell her, like, man, there's another way, but I didn't know it at the time. So I'm sure by now you'd agree that things became a little bit more of a slippery slope for me in college, but I barely had time to do my homework, let alone stop and consider the consequences of my perfectionism. And I also was shying away from deep, meaningful relationships, and so letting anybody fully into what I felt and what I was experiencing would definitely tarnish that very perfectionism that I was working so hard to maintain. So unfortunately, nobody really knew the entire story to tell me any differently, other than my mom, who was telling me not to get that second job because that didn't make sense. So it didn't stop me from applying. Thankfully, I didn't get the job. So but I appreciate her speaking into that, because she was right. So again, the theme was working for me. My perfectionism got me a good job out of college. I graduated with honors, and I moved to a big city, which is exactly what I wanted, thanks to the job that I landed, and everything was working out. So as far as others were concerned, my perfectionism was maintained. And in corporate America, that's where I started when I graduated college, in consulting in corporate America. And I'm sure you can guess that the same theme again continued, but this time the stakes were much, much higher than I even knew at the time. And there was just a constant influx of work, the influx of competition, the never-ending expectation to do more, to do better, and just this fear of like not being good enough, or this fear of being fired because I wasn't doing enough, all sourced from my perfectionism. And it had a field day. My perfectionism had a field day in this environment because there was an there's endless ways to do more, to look more perfect, to be better than the person next to me. And it wasn't even about being better than the person next to me. It was literally about me feeling perfect, or that I did the most and could go to sleep feeling good about myself at night, knowing that there was nothing else more that I could have done to be any perfect in the day. And you pair that with years of traveling across the country weekly for work. I was doing the whole Monday through Thursday, sometimes Monday through Friday, and honestly, sometimes Sunday through Friday for a while. I was doing that to Canada and back, which was really tough. And I traveled almost weekly for work for years. And on the road, if you've ever traveled for work in any capacity, then you know, or you could, if you haven't, then you could assume that eating on the road and having a per diem and having access to whatever you want to eat was probably not great unless you were like really watching what you ate. And so I was just eating things that weren't supporting my body. And every time we went out to dinner as a team, everybody got drinks and alcohol and whatever. And although nobody was really, for the most part, getting like drunk, like having alcohol every night is like not necessary. It wasn't necessary for me. And all of those things made me physically feel unwell. And so you pair this constant influx of work and expectation with feeling physically unwell and tired and traveling and busyness and hustle and hurry, and all of those things paired together just became a very dangerous equation for me very, very fast. About 2 years into my career, I was sleeping about 2 hours a night. And if you've never slept for only 2 hours a night, I feel like maybe in college, maybe you did like an all-nighter. I never did that in college, which is crazy because you would expect that to be the case with my perfectionism. But I was always so structured, and sleep mattered a lot to me, and so I never would do that. But apparently that went out the window when I started in corporate America, because I had so much work to do, and I was so afraid of showing up the next day to a meeting with my clients that I was leading and not knowing what I was talking about. And I was leading workshops at the time with things that weren't very familiar to me. So honestly, in my opinion, I don't know if I really had any business leading those meetings. And I didn't have any support in the room from any colleagues that knew this topic more than I did. And so it was all on me. It felt like the world landed on me. And the C-suite, several of the C-suite members were in those meetings with me, listening from the client to this workshop. And they frequently had negative things to say about how I didn't know what I was talking about. And to be honest, a lot of it was right. I didn't really know a ton of what I was talking about, at least not in full detail. I would study all night, every night, and I would prep demos of the software, and I would sleep for 2 hours. And by sleep, I mean toss and turn for 2 hours, because I was so worried to show up next day to these workshops and not know what I was talking about. And it didn't matter how much I studied. I just didn't have maybe enough experience to compensate for the fact that I didn't really know. And I would go into those workshops and I would do my best, and I would always get negative feedback of how it wasn't enough. And that was so challenging for me. The sleeping 2 hours a night, challenging. The studying all night and feeling like the weight of the world was on my shoulders to deliver something that I couldn't really successfully deliver, challenging. But the fact that, again, like I shared before, of trying so hard and pouring so much effort and energy into something, and then having the result be less than perfect, or having to be told that I wasn't perfect, was hard. It really tore me apart. And so those moments were probably one of the rock bottom moments of my life, especially as it relates to perfectionism. If you've not slept for 2 hours a night, especially for weeks on end, you can imagine the effect that has on your body and on your mental wellness. It's not good. I was a shell of myself. I was so tired. I don't even know how I was operating. I was drinking multiple cups of coffee a day just to make it through the day. And my body was in fight or flight for so long that I think I was just running on adrenaline. And it was just like it was not a good time for me. There's so much more I could say probably about that, but it was a tough time. And I think at this point, signs of anxiety were definitely present. You would think that everything of what I just told you would be enough for me to really recognize the issue. But at the time, I couldn't see it. I couldn't see it. I made excuses for why I had to work so hard and try so hard. And I did recognize that I needed some more boundaries, maybe, and I needed to maybe ask my boss for some help. But that only kept the issues at bay. And my anxiety just continued to increase year over year, even after that. And so I continued to get more paranoid that somebody was going to need something from me at any hour of the day, on any day of the week, including the weekends, to the point that I would check my work phone and my emails throughout the night. I remember I was taking my work phone with me to bed. I would put it in my bed and check it every time I woke up in the middle of the night, which was frequently because I was not sleeping well. And so it wasn't until I started with a therapist who told me, why are you doing that? That's like not normal. That's not something that you need to be doing. That's not something that's good for your mental health. And it's only increasing this paranoia and this fear that somebody's going to need something from you. But I was doing that because I thought I had to. I was constantly overwhelmed by the amount of things on my to-do list, and I was blaming my poor sleep on travel and all these other things. But as the years went on, my sleep continued to get worse, regardless of if I was traveling for work or not. I started to lose my appetite, and I, at one point, started to have panic attacks frequently. And my body was basically just trying to tell me, like, we need help. My body was physically crying out for help. And I didn't know what to do with that, but I had no choice but to start to look at those things and say, like, what's going on here? Why is this getting worse? And so, again, that's when I decided to start looking into a therapist for the first time, which was recommended to me by a really close friend for a while, but it had to take until the point where I could say, like, something is wrong here for me to really consider that as a necessity for myself. And I wish I would have done it sooner. But again, everybody has to get to their own place where they have to decide that it's important for them and that it's necessary for them. And unfortunately, it took me a while to see that. But I started with a therapist. She was recommended to me by a friend. And she did start validating my experiences and sharing with me maybe some things that I thought were normal, maybe actually were not, and not super helpful. And she did start giving me some tools to start assisting with my anxiety. And those tools and those resources and her feedback were mildly helpful to the point where I thought maybe I was okay. I spent several months, talking to her through some of these things and leveraging these tools, and it did get a little bit better. The panic attacks did stop, and I thought, you know what, maybe I don't need a therapist anymore. Maybe I'm okay. So I stopped going. And the problems were at bay because the tools that she gave me were helping, but they definitely did not solve the problem. We did not get to the root of the problem because we did not talk about my perfectionism. We did not talk about where it came from, and we did not talk about the impact that it was having on my life. We just gave me tools to help me manage my perfectionism a little bit more. And so as soon as I went back to the hustle and the hurry of life, my feelings of fear and constantly being overwhelmed started to merge with feelings of being cynical and hopeless. I was easily irritated, and I just constantly felt like empty, where I was just living to work versus working so I could live. And now it's easy for me to look at those signs and see them as a mixture of anxiety and high-functioning depression. But at the time, I just thought they were a natural result of working in corporate America, that I was just jaded by the culture and the things that were going on around me, that I didn't have the rose-colored glasses anymore, and this is just what it was. And that no matter where I worked, no matter what I did, this would be the experience. And I just, again, was a perfectionist at birth, and I was just going to have to live with that. But it actually wasn't until 2023 when all of my symptoms were actually at their worst, regardless of how many hours I worked. At this point, I wasn't sleeping 2 hours a night anymore. I was working a normal amount of hours, and I was trying my best to get some sleep, but I just wasn't sleeping well. And I just hit again another rock bottom or breaking point, you could say, because no matter how many hours I worked, all of a sudden one day I just lost the ability to complete tasks. And if this has never happened to you, then A, you might not even believe me that this is a thing. And B, it might be hard to understand that one day you could just wake up and not really have the ability to complete tasks anymore. But I'm here to tell you that you can. And it's a real thing. And I didn't know that. I didn't know the warning signs of that. I didn't know that's what was coming for me. But it did, and it came fast, and it came out of nowhere, and I just woke up one day, and I was sitting in front of my computer, much like I am right now, and I just remember looking at the things that I had to do and thinking, how am I going to accomplish these things? Because I couldn't do it. I couldn't. I had so much brain fog, and I was so overwhelmed, and I was so terrified, and I was so tired because I wasn't sleeping that I didn't know how I was going to complete anything. And sorry to get emotional, but I just wish I would have known. I wish somebody would have told me. And I'm sure there's podcasts out there, not just my own story, but I just wish somebody would have told me along the way that this is what was coming for me. That if I didn't stop and check some of these things that I was doing, that this was going to be what happened. And I didn't know. Until it happened. And so the only way that I would describe it would be that my brain turned off and I didn't know how to turn it back on. That's exactly what I said to my mom, to my boss at the time, to my coworkers, that my brain has turned off and I don't know where the on switch is. I don't know how long it's going to take. I don't know if I just need a few days of vacation. I don't know what to do, but my brain has left the building and I don't know where it went. I can't find it again. And so I did take vacation days, but unfortunately after I came back, the experience was exactly the same. I just couldn't complete my tasks. I could maybe do 1 or 2 things in a day, but nowhere near how much I actually needed to do to successfully do my job, which for my perfectionism was so scary because I couldn't even consider being perfect because I couldn't even consider completing all of my work in a singular day. And how many days can you really keep that up? And so I decided that it was probably time to find a new therapist who, thank God, in the first session identified the severity of the situation and she named it immediately as clinical burnout, which I had heard the word burnout. We all have many, many times. I think people throw it around almost as easily as they throw around anxiety or stress or anything else. And I just equated it to being stressed or highly stressed or, well, I'm just burnt out. But I didn't really know that this was a real clinical issue that existed in the world. I didn't know that it had symptoms. I didn't know that it had consequences, or at least that the consequences were this heavy until she told me. And I started doing some research on it. I started looking up podcasts. I started looking up symptoms online, and every single thing that it said was exactly what I was experiencing. And I had just never heard that. I had never heard that was something that could happen to me after years and years of my brain like thinking that it was fighting for its life. Years and years of striving, exhaustion, overwhelmed, anxiety, and essentially my brain, I know it's a popular thing right now on TikTok, if you're on TikTok, to say like, oh, my brain thinks I'm being chased by a bear. But that's really what it felt like. My brain thought that I was being chased to death for years of my life. And that is the panic and the striving that I existed out of for years, to the point where my brain got so exhausted and so tired and my nervous system could not keep up anymore, that in order to protect me, in order to save my life, it had to shut down. And so my brain quite literally did turn off, because it was trying to keep me safe, because I couldn't expend that much energy anymore and still be fine. And so you can imagine how scary it was for me in that moment, and you could imagine how scary it was for me to hear that from my therapist, and you can imagine how scary it was for probably the next 4 months, where I had to tell my boss and my coworkers. I had to initiate a 3-month sabbatical from work. I had to advocate for that to several bosses who somewhat agreed or maybe didn't really understand, and I had to share it with friends, and I had to begin working through this year-long journey of anxiety, high-functioning depression, and burnout, all with a new therapist who, unfortunately for her, was coming in at such a critical moment where I needed her. I needed help. And I wish I had gone to her sooner. So we already had the rapport and she already knew the story. But unfortunately, she was coming in hot. She was coming in right at the depths of the issue. And she has been so great and such a blessing from God for me. But that is kind of the point where I was looking at it and thinking, wow, I didn't really notice that this is where I was at until it happened. And so I went from barely understanding that I had a problem and thinking that I was just keeping my problems at bay and that my mental health was okay and maybe I didn't even need a therapist, all at the same time. My mental health and my mental wellness was crashing down around me, and it was on public display in front of my friends, family, in front of my coworkers. And this perfectionism that I had worked so hard to maintain for my entire life honestly came crashing down all at once, all around me. Everything that I built my life on came crashing down all around me. And as I looked around at the state of my well-being and at the state of my life, I began to see it all for what it really was the entire time. My entire life was me just striving for perfection until I exhausted myself on that journey of achieving something that was never even possible to begin with. And now here we were at the end of it, at the end of myself, where I quite literally had nothing else to offer. I had nothing else to stand on, nothing else to build my life on, because it all came crashing down around me. It wasn't sustainable for me at all. So I guess you could say that in hindsight, it's 2020. But if you watch the first episode, then you know that my eyesight is horrible. So naturally, it doesn't come as a surprise that I didn't see very clearly for quite a while. So I spent many hours, mostly in my sabbatical, grieving over the reality that everything that I worked so hard for felt so fragile and so unsustainable for me, and it all fell apart. But I am here to say that I'm not going to leave you on that note, that there is still hope in my story. And so at the same time of me grieving and me looking around and seeing all the things that has fallen apart around me, that in those moments of heartbreak and desperation are where I truly found Jesus. Because, again, it wouldn't shock you that my vision is horrible and that he was there the entire time, but I just couldn't see it. I couldn't see him until I was finally at the very end of myself and my own strength, and there he was, waiting. He was waiting for me, and there were so many moments across my entire story that he was there waiting, that he gave me an option to come back, that he gave me the option to release me from this striving. I just didn't see it. I didn't see it at the time. And so I had spent years as a Christian attending church, but I never knew what it was like to really need Jesus, to really need to depend on him with my life, because I could always do it on my own. And I had always believed that Jesus has redeemed me, but apparently not enough for me to feel free from the striving, because I still thought I had something to prove, and I still thought I wasn't good enough when I was less than perfect. And I had always heard that he was a good shepherd, but it wasn't until I was the lost sheep who had strayed so far from home. And I didn't even know that I was lost, and I didn't know how I got there. But for me to see that he had been chasing me down that entire time, waiting to bring me back home safely, all I had to do was just turn around and look. He was there the whole time. And so, as hard as that journey has been for me, and as easy as it is for me to look back and see every single moment of imperfection and every single moment where I would just love to talk to my younger self and wake her up and tell her that there was another way, I am so glad that God in his kindness allowed me the free will to walk my own journey and to make my own choices, because I don't think if I would have gotten all the way to the end of myself that I would have truly seen Jesus right there. I think if everything in my life was fine and well and good, that I don't think I would have got here. I don't think that I would be relying on Jesus as much as I am, that I would know him as a good father and a good shepherd, that I would really see what it means to depend on Jesus and need him. And so, in my years of pain and honestly moments of anger with God, it was hard for me to consider that God was good when it was so hard for me to land a new job, or I couldn't get into grad school, and I couldn't understand how a good God would allow me to sit in the same suffering, because that didn't bring me any closer to God. And so honestly, there was many moments that I was angry because I just couldn't understand how my circumstances were going to be used for my good or his glory. That just didn't make sense for me. But again, hindsight is 2020. I can see that he never forced me to rely on my own striving and pursue the path that I did. But in love, like I said, he allowed me in my free will to choose that path, even though I'm sure it broke his heart more than it did my own eventually. And despite what I used to think, he wasn't withholding a new job from me. He wasn't just keeping me there out of punishment or lack of care, but it was simply out of love, because it never would have solved the issue for me to have a new job. It never would have solved the issue for me to run away to something else to pour my perfectionism into. But what really served me, and the truest act of love, I believe, and mercy, was using the brokenness of the situation that I created, that I was living in, that I chose. And yes, you could also argue that as a result of our broken world and as a result of sin, but a situation and a path that I chose had ultimately was maybe the only way to lead me back to the only one who was really capable of healing me and restoring me back. And so I'm not sure if my story would have looked different, if I would have came to the same conclusion that Jesus was the only thing I needed, that I didn't need to strive anymore, that I was free from all of those things. And so as easy as it is to look back and feel so much pain and confusion and just want to shake that little girl awake, it's also easy for me to see the goodness and the grace of God along the way, and that he did in fact use my suffering and my choices for his glory and my good in the end. And so my perfectionism would love to say and love to tell you that I am fully healed and that everything is amazing and great all the time. But there is some truth to that. I am very far from perfect, and I am still very much so on the journey, but I have found so much hope in trusting the creator of the universe with my life versus relying on myself for almost 30 years of my life. Because I can say that there is so much more joy and hope and freedom in knowing that the creator of all of the universe, the stars, the heavens, the earth, and everything else in between has it. He has it. He has me. He has a good plan for me, plans to prosper, for a hope and a future, and that weight does not sit on my shoulders anymore. And that it is not up to me and my perfectionism to gain anything at all, because I am already good enough. I am already worthy just as a daughter of the King, and not in anything else that I could accomplish or do. And so I could share so many more details of the trials along my journey, and so many more details of the Lord's kindness and how he was in every single detail of my story. But I do want to leave you with some practical thoughts. So if you or anybody else that you know is walking through a season that sounds similar, that maybe some of these tools and resources would be super helpful for you. So the first of those things, like I mentioned a couple times, is therapy. And I know this is maybe a little bit of a taboo topic for some people. I hope it's becoming a little less taboo. And I know some people might look at it as like, oh, how could that possibly help you to talk to somebody? But I'm just here to say that after working with my therapist now for, I guess a little over a year now, my current therapist, that, like I said, she has been such a godsend for me. The therapy really has given me so many words to put to my experiences, so many things that I've been able to name and look at from a different perspective. She was the one that told me, you aren't born a perfectionist. That was something that your brain created to protect you, and it's not protecting you anymore. But the hope is that you can work to unlearn that you can unlearn those things, and you're not just you're not just a victim to those things. You're not just born that way and have to figure out how to cope. You can actually have power over those things and power to unlearn them. And I've never heard that before. And so therapy for me has just been such an awesome resource to talk to somebody about what I'm walking through and have her validate it and have her talk me through a different alternative or a different perspective. And it has just been really life-giving. So even if you're not in a place of dire need, even if you're not at rock bottom, I would really consider therapy, because outside of the dire need, quote unquote, or the rock bottom that I was in, quote unquote, it has been so helpful for me in other aspects of my life as well that I didn't even know I needed to look at or assess or to touch. And so honestly, even like I said, even if you don't think you have anxiety, depression, burnout, and your story doesn't sound as quote unquote severe as mine, I would challenge you to consider it anyway. Because I think everybody has something to consider and something to learn and something to reflect on themselves, and not just for the purpose of being perfect, not for the purpose of fixing something within yourself, but simply for the purpose of having more empathy towards yourself. I could have empathy towards my younger self who didn't know any better, who didn't know the things that she was up against, who, was just trying her best to be her best, but didn't really know that that wasn't necessary. And so having empathy with myself and having a different perspective on these pieces of myself that were really just trying to protect me, but maybe they weren't anymore. But yet having somebody to tell you that there's another way, that there's tools and there's resources and there's another perspective to look at your life and be able to grow in a different way. And so therapy for me has been super beneficial. If you are a follower of Jesus, I would recommend going to somebody who is a follower of Jesus, but I don't think that's necessary per se. Happy to talk about how to find them. If you have questions, let me know. The second thing I wanted to talk about were spiritual disciplines. And this kind of came to me at a really good time. If you've heard of the book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer, I'm a really big John Mark Comer stan. So shout out to him, and anything him and his team has ever put out has really blessed me. But he talks about spiritual disciplines a lot. And I had never really heard of spiritual disciplines in my walk with faith. But they are something that has really changed the way that I interact with God, with Jesus, and the way that I interact and figure out ways to grow in my mental health as well. So the first thing that I was doing when I was really struggling to sleep was finding some different faith-based, Christian-based meditation apps. And so the first of them is called the Pause app, like Pause. You can look it up on the App Store. And the second one is Lectio 365, Lectio 365. And both of those resources have been super valuable to me. There are still things that I do every day and something that help ground me. I do them right in the morning when I first wake up and then right at night before I go to bed. So it's the first thing that I hear and it's the last thing that I hear in the day. And it really bookends my sleep. And it has been something that has helped calm my mind and just speak truth and life over me, either right before I go to sleep or before I start my day. And that has just really changed how I exist throughout the day, and the amount of anxiety that I have and the amount of stress and overwhelmed feelings that I have. It doesn't obviously cure the problem, but it allows me space to just sit and rest on Jesus instead of immediately getting up and hurrying to the next thing. The second thing is silence and solitude. It's very similar, but silence and solitude meaning straight silence and not a meditation app, not somebody speaking over you, like quite literally just sitting in silence, which if you've never done it before, you've never heard that before, can sound kind of whack, a little crazy, but I'm here to just say, maybe just try it. You can look it up, do some research on it yourself, of course, but there is just something about our world today that is so busy and it's so rushed, and especially with social media, that we can barely even stand in line without looking at our phone. We can't even go to the bathroom without looking at our phone. Like, any waking moment that we're not actively doing something, work or otherwise, we are looking at our phone. And so the constant influx of information our brain was never intended to handle. And I think we're seeing a lot of the effects of that on mental wellness or even our attention span, etc. And so one way that I have found to really combat a lot of those challenges has been with silence and solitude. And so this was something that was hard for me. It was really challenging for me, but I would start out with maybe a meditation or reading some of the Bible. I would read a psalm. If you're familiar with the Psalms, I would just pick a psalm and read it or do my meditation for the day. And then I would spend the next however many minutes just in straight silence. I would just sit there in silence. And I started out with 1 minute. I went to maybe like 3 to 5 minutes. And then I went all the way to 15 minutes, 30 minutes, until I didn't even have to time it anymore because I just loved sitting there peacefully. And that was so challenging for me. When I first started, my brain was so overwhelmed. There were so many thoughts. I couldn't focus on anything. I couldn't focus on God. I didn't know if I was supposed to say something or not. My perfectionism was like, I don't know if I'm doing this right. Well, I'm here to tell you that there's not a right way to do it. And secondly, that it does get easier the more times that you do it, and that your brain actually does feel more calm. And so now, actually previously, before I started doing that, I would fill any waking second with noise. I would have to be doing something with music. I couldn't drive in silence, anything. I had to have something playing at all times around me because my brain was so used to existing within noise that any silence was hard. And so after I started practicing silence and solitude, it was much easier, to the point where now sometimes I play music thinking that that's going to be fun and helpful, and it's actually too much. It's too much chaos for my brain. I can start to identify that there's already so much chaos happening within my brain that actually it might be better to just be in silence. And that's actually more peaceful for me sometimes now, which I never would have thought to be the case. So, which is challenging to maybe think about that or do some more research on that. There's some books that talk about it as well that I'll recommend here in a second, but that's something that has really been helpful for me. The third spiritual discipline that I'd love to talk about is Sabbath. Again, if you're a follower of Jesus, you might consider Sunday a Sabbath. It doesn't have to be Sunday. Technically, that is the day of the Lord, correct? And we go to church and etc. But I would recommend also maybe looking into a day of Sabbath. And so maybe yours doesn't fall on a Sunday. For me, at the moment, it's falling on a Monday because I have Mondays free at the moment and most people do not. And so it's a very easy day for me to feel not distracted, like I don't have to say no to plans or etc. And it's a very easy day for me to control what happens in my Sabbath day without the temptation to fill it up with a bunch of work or other things. And so I would just challenge you to maybe pick a day, plan it into your schedule, and think about what would be most restful for you in that day. And it doesn't necessarily have to be don't go to the gym, only sit on the couch, don't take a walk, etc. Like, it can be whatever you feel is restful for you. And then plan to do your quote unquote work. So if laundry doesn't feel restful for you, it doesn't really feel restful for me. I'll typically not do laundry on Monday. I will purposely do it either Sunday, so that way it's already done, or I'll just wait until the next day to do it on Tuesday. So that way I can really protect Mondays. And it doesn't always happen super perfectly, but it has been great to have an intentional day to specifically set aside for rest. And so those are kind of some spiritual disciplines. There's a bunch of others like fasting, etc. So you can look into those as well. Again, I'll talk about some books that will kind of put you in the right direction here in a second. But to keep going, a couple other things that were super valuable for me along this journey was having authentic and deep friendships. That's something that I haven't really had most of my life. And it was something that I was almost forced into because I just needed help. I needed to be honest with people with where I was at, and there was just so much support in that, of really bringing people into that suffering and that pain with me, and having people that really knew me and knew my story there to hold the hope with me when it felt too heavy for me to hold by myself, and having a church community to point me back to Jesus when the lies felt too loud was super important as well. So I would just challenge you if you feel like you're in a similar spot and you don't really have a lot of close friends, or maybe it's a desire of yours and you are searching for it. It can be hard. It took me years to really find that community. And so if it's not an overnight thing, that's okay too. But I would just challenge you that that's been something that's super helpful for me in this journey, or just life in general. So yeah, the next thing would be journaling. If you listen to episode 1, or if you know me at all, then you know that I just released an end of the year reflection journal. And that was really as a result of me finding a love for journaling. Through this season of having all these big, heavy emotions and not knowing what to do with, I would just word vomit them out to everybody around me, which was not probably super helpful for me, and definitely not super helpful for anybody else. It was just me vomiting a bunch of heavy stuff to people who maybe weren't necessarily qualified or trained to know what to do with it, which is fair because not everybody's a therapist. And so I found journaling as a way to document my prayers and really process through these heavy emotions with God. And that was just such an awesome outlet for me to spend time with the Lord versus word vomiting it out to other people at random. And so I am a big fan of journaling. If you've never journaled before, if you hate it, I used to be in the same boat. I never owned a journal. I've never journaled other than the last 2 years. I used to think that wasn't for me. I didn't have time to do it. Too much work. No. But I'm here to tell you that after doing it and trying it, it has been so beneficial. And I would just recommend just to try it, just to start. If you need prompts, you could look prompts up. There's a really cool format called a manual journaling. You can look that up too. It's basically where you journal as if God's talking to you and imagining what he would say to you. It's really powerful. But what I do is I just start with a blank piece of paper, which I know doesn't work for everybody. So I'm not here to tell you that's the only way to do it, but I'll just start with a blank piece of paper and I just start writing anything that's on my mind. Anything that I'm holding, anything I need to let go of, anything that's worrying me, bothering me, stressing me out, anything that I'm grateful for, I'll share that too. Like today, the sun, I'm so grateful that the sun's out today. I'm so grateful that I woke up and I have air in my lungs. Like anything, I'm just grateful to the Lord for those things. And then I will share with him the things that are on my heart that I need to either surrender or that I need guidance on, or anything that I'm feeling if I'm angry about something or that I don't understand. I'll share those things too, really authentically in my journal. And then something I've been doing in the last 6 months is I will leave 10 minutes at the end. I'll do my silence and solitude at this time after I'm done journaling. So I'll get out everything I need to say, and then I will spend probably about 10 or 15 minutes in silence, just listening to the Lord, allowing him a chance to respond back to me with anything that he has to say. And that has been such a sweet time. And I will write his response or anything that I feel the Holy Spirit speaking to me in red on the bottom of my journal. And so that way, when I look back in my journal, it's easier for me to pinpoint what are the things that came from the Lord and what are the things that were just my words. And it's been really sweet to look back on the things that he's been sharing to me over the last year or so of this journey. And so we'll just encourage you to try journaling. If you haven't, if you want to check out my reflection journal, the link again will be in the show notes. It's on the last recording as well. You can find it at the Yalt Instagram bio. It's meant to be an end of the year reflection journal, but there's nothing to stop you from doing it at any other point in the year as well. The next thing is just a list of books and resources. I already mentioned The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer. You could also check out Practicing the Way by John Mark Comer if you've already read the other one. Both are really great. Another oldie but a goodie is Celebrating Discipline by Richard Foster. Also a really great book. It talks very specifically about each spiritual discipline and why it matters and why it's important. And it goes chapter by chapter. So even if you're interested in using it as a resource just to pick out specific disciplines and understand why they're important and how to start them, you could just read specific chapters. That's how I've used it in the past, although I've read the whole book. But I do frequently use it to skip around. There's another book called Burnout, and I meant to look up the author, so I'm so sorry that I didn't. How rude of me. But I think the author, her name is Emily. There's actually 2 authors. They're both women. It's geared towards women, I believe, and it's written by 2 women who I believe one has experience in the medical field or in the mental health field, etc. I'm really not doing these ladies justice. I'm so sorry, but there's sisters, and the book is really really good. It's not a faith-based book, but it does have a lot of really awesome research and lived experiences from people, so it really gives you a clear idea of what is burnout, what is actually happening in your brain during this process. And it really gave me a lot of words to put to my experiences, to know that the things that I was experiencing was not just a fluke. It wasn't just me. It was really a scientific thing, and it made a lot more sense and made me feel a lot less alone. So I would really recommend reading this, even if you don't feel like you're experiencing burnout. I would just read it to just educate yourself on what it is, because I just wish that I would have read this beforehand and knew what was coming and knew the signs and symptoms ahead of time, so maybe it wouldn't have happened. But it's Emily and Amelia Nagoski. If you just look up Burnout book on Amazon, you'll find it. It's like a black cover with pink and red writing. So that has been a really awesome one for me too. The last resource, again, it's not faith-based, but it's called Regulate and Rewire Podcast by Amanda Armstrong. That podcast has just been super educational for me on anxiety and depression. That's actually how I found out that I had depression. I was listening to one of her podcasts, and I started listening out of curiosity or to hear the anxiety part, and she started talking about symptoms of depression. And every single one, I was like, oh, I have that. I think that's me. And I remember showing up to therapy that week and telling her, I think I have depression. And she was like, yeah, actually, I had this questionnaire pulled up on my screen because I was going to ask you some of these depression screening questions because I think so too. And so that podcast for me has been super helpful in just educating me again on what does it look like to have anxiety, depression, panic attacks, etc., and what to do with those things. She talks a lot about how to regulate your nervous system as well. So scientifically, different tactics that you can try physically to help regulate your body and your nervous system. And so that's another awesome resource as well. And so those are some of my tips on how I have been able to work through the season of anxiety, depression, burnout, healing from my perfectionism, and ultimately doing it with Jesus as the center of my life. And so I hope that this episode has been helpful for you. I apologize that there was a lot of moments that I got emotional, but it's something that's just I almost got emotional again. Why? It's something that's just really close to my heart, and something that I just hope that this podcast or my story maybe helps somebody realize that that's not the only way, that there is another way, and that the way is Jesus, and that we do not have to rely on ourselves and our own perfectionism and our own striving to be worth something or to be good enough. And even if that's not your story, again, I just hope that there is some hope or light in my story of mental health and something that resonates with you or is helpful with you and maybe your own journey of mental health. Because again, there's just another way in that too. Therapy and all of these other things are awesome tools, and there's just another way for us to live without being consumed maybe by all of these things. And not to say that, not to shame anybody if that's your story, because it's still my story. I'm not on the other side of it all the way yet, and I might never be until I exit this life and move into eternity. But yeah, like I said, I just hope that this finds the people who maybe need to hear it, or will bring light or acknowledgement or resources to somebody who could benefit from it. So with that being said, if you have any questions, or if there's anything you want to hear more about, anything you don't think I addressed, or any other resources that you found helpful that you want to share with other people, I would just welcome you to plop those in the comments down below, because I would love for this to be a conversation and not just me talking to you, because like I said, I don't have any I didn't study this. I don't have any credentials per se other than my own experience. So I would love for this to be a conversation and for the conversation to continue. If there are more questions or more things that you want to hear more about in my own journey, I am sure there'll be more episodes with other people talking about other people's journey as well. And so I hope you'll stick around and listen more. So with that being said, there's this week's episode. We were jumping right into the deep end, and I hope you stuck around to hear the whole thing. Thank you if you've made it this far, and we'll see you next time. See ya.